let my brother-in-law and his family stay at our small house for a week. But they stayed 2 months making a mess, so I finally snapped and kicked them out. Now my wife said she would divorce me if I did not apologize to them. The words still echo in my memory, a perfect, agonizing summary of how my life dissolved. It all started so casually, the kind of casualness that, in retrospect, looks like a carefully laid trap. Alan, a 34-year-old software architect, had been married to Chloe, 32, for 3 years, and together for 6. Our life was comfortable, quiet, perhaps too quiet, in our 2-bedroom house in the suburbs. That quiet was precisely what I valued. I am an introvert who thrives on order, a necessity born out of a chaotic childhood, where noise and unpredictability were the norm. I always aimed to avoid conflict. Always. I came home one Tuesday evening, just past 6 o'clock. The key had barely turned in the lock when I heard the distinct, high-pitched scream of children, followed by a deeper, booming laugh that I knew instantly. Harry, Chloe's older brother, 35. I stepped into the living room, and the air immediately felt thick. The room, usually neat and reflecting my need for tidiness, was suddenly cluttered with bags, coats draped over the sofa, and 2 young boys, Harry's 9-year-old and 5-year-old, wrestling near the ottoman. The boys quieted momentarily to stare at the new entrant, then went back to their skirmish. "Alan, you're finally home," Harry bellowed, rising from the sofa with a grin that felt too wide. His wife, Sarah, offered a meek wave. I stood there, feeling like an intruder in my own home. I looked at the piles of luggage near the door, then back at Chloe, who was nervously hovering in the kitchen doorway. "What is going on?" I asked, my voice flat, betraying the confusion churning in my stomach. I do not recall a conversation about guests, especially ones with this much luggage. Chloe pulled me into the kitchen, shutting the door softly behind us. The smell of Harry's cheap cologne and the overwhelming scent of unfamiliar cooking oil seemed to cling to the air. "I am so sorry, honey," she whispered, her brow furrowed. "I completely forgot to tell you. Harry's house is getting minor renovations. A plumbing issue, nothing major. They just need a place to crash for a week. Instead of them blowing hundreds of dollars on a hotel, I told them they could stay with us. A week. 7 days. That was the timeline." I felt a surge of annoyance, a tight knot forming in my chest. Forget? This was not forgetting to pick up milk. This was inviting a family of 4 into our small space without a word. But the sight of her nervous, pleading eyes and the sound of Harry's heavy footsteps on the floor above me did what it always did. It triggered my avoidance mechanism. A fight now would be loud, awkward, and would definitely involve confronting Harry later. "A week," I repeated, rubbing the bridge of my nose. "You forgot to tell me about a family of 4 moving into our house for a week." "I know, I am awful. But it is just a week, and I honestly did not think it would be a big deal. They are family." That phrase, usually comforting, felt like a cage closing around me. I swallowed the protest forming in my throat. It was not worth fighting over. Just grit my teeth, keep my head down, and it would be over by next Tuesday. I resigned myself. Later that week, I vented my frustrations to Marcus Harris, my friend and colleague, during a quick lunch break at the office. Marcus, pragmatic and always boundary aware. Listen to my account of the unannounced invasion. Alan, you have got to nip it in the bud, Marcus said, carefully slicing his chicken. 1 week turns into 2, 2 turns into 6 months. If you are already annoyed, you need to set the boundaries now. Confirm the date they are leaving. Be firm. I nodded, agreeing with the logic, yet knowing I lacked the courage. Yeah, I will. I do not want to make things awkward for Chloe. It is only 7 more days. I let Marcus's good advice slide off me, choosing the path of least resistance. That path, as it turned out, led straight to an emotional cliff edge. The initial 7 days were already stressful. The noise, the constant motion, the general disregard for keeping things tidy. I should have ended it right there. I should have told Chloe, the week is up. They need to leave. But I did not. I could not bring myself to do it. And that was my first critical failure. The first week ended, and the renovations were suddenly not minor anymore. The promised week ended with a text from Chloe that landed like a lead weight in my gut. The renovation found structural damage. It is going to be longer. Longer. That single word hung in the air, mocking the carefully constructed walls of my non-confrontational life. That evening, I got home and found the whole group assembled in the living room, a scene that had quickly become the new normal. Harry was sprawled on the sofa, scrolling on his phone, while Sarah was attempting a half-hearted game with the kids, the 9-year-old demanding a specific toy and the 5-year-old whining loudly. I walked in, dropping my briefcase by the door, and before I could even take off my jacket, Chloe started, her voice unnaturally bright. "Honey," the contractor called. There was some major plumbing damage that caused structural issues, so it will take much longer, maybe 2 months, maybe 3. I stared at her, waiting for the pause, the moment where she would say, "So I told them they need to check into a hotel." But it never came. Instead, Chloe turned to her brother and smiled apologetically. Harry and Sarah were actually going to leave and go stay in a hotel or find a short-term rental because they did not know how long it would take. She announced to the room, drawing attention to their supposed altruism. Then she turned back to me, her eyes large and pleading. But I insisted that they stay on with us. After all, we are family. And we have the space, right, Alan? They are waiting to hear that it is fine if they stay. The air thickened. 4 pairs of eyes, Harry's, Sarah's, and even the boys', were fixed on me. It was manipulative, a calculated ambush. She knew that in a situation like that, confronted by the entire group, my deeply ingrained aversion to conflict would paralyze me. Saying no would not just be saying no to Chloe, it would be rejecting Harry, disappointing Sarah, and causing a massive, immediate scene that would make the next few hours unbearable. I felt the resentment bubbling up, hot and metallic, but I immediately forced it down. My face, I am sure, gave nothing away. I offered a weak smile. Right. Of course. We are family. Stay as long as you need to. Harry clapped his hands together once, a loud, self-satisfied sound. See, Chloe. I told you Alan was a good guy. Thank you, man. Really appreciate it. I felt a flash of self-disgust. I had been coerced, manipulated. I should have stood up and said, "No, this is my home, and I need notice." But instead, I had rolled over, trading 2 months of my peace for 10 seconds of avoiding awkwardness. And those 2 months became a slow, agonizing suffocation. Our small, quiet house was perpetually loud. The boys treated the space like a public playground, leaving sticky residue on surfaces, toys scattered everywhere, and their clothes abandoned in the living room. Harry and Sarah were slobs of the highest degree. They hardly ever cleaned up after themselves. I found myself silently wiping down counters after they cooked, stepping over their discarded shoes, and even folding their laundry just to keep the chaos at bay. The financial aspect added a cold, hard layer to my distress. While Harry paid for the groceries, the spike in utility costs was substantial. The water bill, the electricity, it was through the roof. I tried, multiple times, to talk to Chloe about it. "Honey, we need to ask Harry to contribute to utilities." I would start gently, usually late at night, in bed. "It has been 2 months, and the bills are killing us." She would sigh, rolling onto her side. "Oh, I know, sweetie. I will talk to him tomorrow. It is just, they are going through a tough time financially. His business, with Dad, it is struggling right now." But tomorrow came, and nothing changed. I would bring it up again a week later. "Did you talk to him, Chloe? The electricity bill is almost $300 higher than last month." "I tried, Alan. But he just gets so defensive. I will try again. Do not worry about it, okay?" I worried about it. I worried about the mess. I worried about the noise. I worried that Chloe, in the company of her brother, seemed to change. She became less mindful of me, prioritizing their needs and her attempts to manage their chaos over our relationship. Every time I tried to express my feelings, how crowded I felt, how stressed I was, she would shut down the conversation, either with a quick apology followed by inaction, or by deflecting back to Harry's difficulties. It made me feel like I was being ignored, completely and totally. I had been trying to communicate, trying to resolve this, but my feelings were deemed secondary to her family's comfort. My quiet attempts at communication were continually rejected, fueling a deep, burning resentment. The only sanctuary I had left was the office. I started volunteering for overtime, accepting every late assignment that came my way. I would work until 7, sometimes 8, not because I needed the money, but because I dreaded going home. It was sickening. I was sacrificing my rest, my time, my entire work-life balance, just to avoid spending 3 extra hours in the loud, dirty house that no longer felt like mine. Marcus would often joke about my dedication, but I knew the real reason the office was quiet and my house was not. My internal pressure was building, turning me into a hollow shell of myself. I knew I was reaching the end of my rope. Something was going to break, and I was terrified of what that something might be. The 2-month mark hit, and I felt like a stranger in my own house, a visitor with no rights to the space he paid for. The air was heavy with the smell of stale food and damp clothes. The constant, drumming sound of children and Harry's loud television viewing had become a migraine-inducing soundtrack to my life. I had become an expert in avoidance, timing my arrival home after Chloe was usually busy and retreating instantly to the bedroom. This evening, however, the universe decided I could not retreat. I unlocked the front door just after 8. Bone-tired from another 4 hours of unnecessary overtime. As I stepped inside, my foot met something wet and sticky. I looked down. The living room floor was coated in a thin, milky film. Someone had spilled a large amount of milk, and it had been sitting long enough that the edges were starting to crust. The rest of the scene was pure, unadulterated chaos. Toys were strewn across the carpet, dirty clothes, including several items of Harry's I recognized, were piled in the corner, and the sticky milk was everywhere. In the middle of this mess, the two boys were arguing loudly over a beat-up plastic toy, their voices shrill and grating. Harry and Sarah were kneeling nearby with paper towels, supposedly cleaning, but they seemed far more interested in the reality show blaring from the television. They were wiping half-heartedly, moving their hands slowly without any sense of urgency or genuine effort. They did not even register my presence. That was it. That sight, the utter disregard for my home, the sickening indifference to the mess they were creating and living in, snapped the final thread of my restraint. 2 months of resentment, 2 months of ignored pleas, 2 months of being displaced from my own life, all boiled over into a blinding, metallic rage. My shyness, my non-confrontational nature, simply evaporated. There was nothing left but pure, reactive fury. What in the hell is this? I yelled, the sound coming from somewhere deep in my chest. It was the loudest I had raised my voice in years. Harry looked up, annoyed that his show had been interrupted. "Oh, hey Alan." "Yeah." The 5-year-old knocked over the gallon. "We are getting it." "Getting it." I took 2 steps further into the room, pointing a shaking hand at the floor.
"You are barely touching it."
"You have been here for 2 months, making this house a dumping ground." I cannot take this anymore. My voice was raw, laced with the panic and stress I had internalized. The pressure I had carried for 8 weeks poured out. I am not just talking about the milk. I am talking about the clothes, the toys, the sheer noise, the lack of consideration you have shown for my space, my life. I have been working overtime just to avoid coming back here. I looked directly at Harry, ignoring Sarah and the suddenly silent children. I want this room cleaned. Not just the milk, but everything. And when you are done, I want you out. Out of my house. Now. The words were final, absolute. They felt like a cleansing fire. I watched Harry's face flicker through surprise, indignation, and finally, anger. "Excuse me," he sputtered, rising to his feet. "You heard me," I said, my voice dangerously low now, spent a volume but heavy with threat. "I tried to put up with you, for Chloe, but I cannot do this anymore. You are leaving. Tonight." I did not wait for his response. I spun around, grabbing my briefcase, and marched toward the bedroom. The last thing I heard before slamming the door with a force that rattled the frame was Harry shouting my name. I was shaking from the adrenaline, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the fear, there was a profound, shocking sense of relief. It was over. The chaos was gone. I collapsed onto the bed, physically and emotionally drained. It was late, and Chloe was still out with friends. I intended to wait up for her to deal with the fallout, but the exhaustion of 2 months of anxiety, capped by that explosive release, proved too much. I fell into a deep, heavy sleep. A few hours later, I was violently shaken awake. I blinked against the sudden bedroom light to find Chloe standing over me, her face pale, her eyes burning with pure fury. "What did you do?" she screamed, her voice tight with suppressed tears and absolute rage. It took me a few seconds to process the time, the confrontation, and her state. I knew instantly she had heard from Harry. He had texted her, painting me as a vicious monster who had thrown his family out onto the street. "They packed up and left while you were sleeping." "Alan," she hissed, pulling the covers off me. "They are gone. They are in a hotel." "How could you be so cruel?"
This is my family.
I sat up, pushing the hair back from my face. I was justified, Chloe. They were intolerable. What followed was a brutal, screaming match that dwarfed any argument we had ever had. She called me heartless, uncaring, and selfish. I called her blind, manipulative, and a poor communicator. The core of the fight was simple. I believed I had protected my home and my sanity. She believed I had disrespected her family and, by extension, her. The exhaustion in the room was palpable, yet she seemed fueled by righteous family anger. She looked down at me, and I saw a finality in her eyes that chilled me to the bone. It was not just an argument, it was an ultimatum. The exhaustion in the room was palpable, yet she seemed fueled by righteous family anger. She looked down at me, and I saw a finality in her eyes that chilled me to the bone. It was not just an argument, it was an ultimatum. The exhaustion in the room was palpable, yet she seemed fueled by righteous family anger. She looked down at me, and I saw a finality in her eyes that chilled me to the bone. It was not just an argument, it was an ultimatum. Then came the dagger. "They deserve an apology, Alan. A sincere one, for humiliating them and treating them like criminals." She took a shuddering breath, her eyes cold. "If you do not call Harry and apologize to them all within 1 week, I will file for a divorce." The threat was stunning, absolute. It hung in the air, a line drawn in the sand I never expected to see. She was serious. Deadly serious. The shock of her words silenced my rage instantly. I looked at her, no longer seeing my wife, but a stranger who would sacrifice 6 years of our relationship to defend the people who had actively destroyed our peace. We did not speak for the rest of the night. She moved her things to the guest room. The marital crisis had begun. We were separated by 10 feet of carpet and an unbridgeable chasm of betrayal. The week of silence began immediately after Chloe delivered her ultimatum. The emotional shock of her words, the threat of divorce over defending my own home, was paralyzing. It was a level of betrayal I had not anticipated, even after 2 months of being ignored. We existed as ghosts in our own house. Chloe slept in the guest room, and I stayed in the master, the door shut firmly. We moved on parallel tracks. We got ready for work at separate times, passing in the hallway with eyes fixed rigidly forward. The quiet was now oppressive, not peaceful. It was the silence of a house where the foundation had cracked. I spent the work week in a fog. Marcus noticed instantly that something was deeply wrong. I told him the truncated version, the outburst, Harry's departure, and the ultimatum, divorce. Marcus said, leaning back in his chair, his usual confident demeanor momentarily shaken. Alan, that is completely disproportionate. Your wife is prioritizing her brother's comfort over your sanity and your marriage. That is a massive red flag, man. His words, though harsh, simply validated the sickening feeling in my stomach. I knew it was disproportionate. I knew it was unfair. But the deeper conflict was internal. I had finally found the courage to stand up for myself, to break my pattern of avoidance. And the result was the imminent collapse of my marriage. Was I the villain? Was my demand for peace truly so heinous that it warranted divorce? I wrestled with the apology. The logical part of my brain screamed,
Do not apologize.
You were right. My deepest emotional fear, however, the fear of abandonment that made me non-confrontational in the first place, whispered, Just apologize. It is a small price to pay to get your life back, to keep Chloe. But apologizing felt like sacrificing myself. Respect. Like admitting that I was the abusive one, the petty one. It meant sanctioning the chaos and the utter disrespect her family had shown. It meant agreeing to Chloe's narrative that I was wrong for protecting myself. I could not do it. The cost was too high. The days crawled by, each one bringing me closer to the deadline. I found myself obsessively replaying the confrontation, the spilled milk, Harry's lazy response, my explosion. I realized that my anger was not just about the mess. It was about the 2 months of being invisible to my wife. Every time she shut down a conversation, she reinforced the old wound that told me my needs did not matter. Harry's family were just the symptom, but Chloe's lack of support was the disease. The fear in those 7 days was crippling. I loved Chloe. 6 years is a long time. Built on shared experiences, dreams, and a comfortable companionship. But I kept returning to the moment she issued the threat. She did not defend me. She did not acknowledge my suffering. She immediately sided with the people who had caused us both so much distress. That was the core betrayal. On the 5th day, I found a note from her on the kitchen counter when I came home. It was just a short list of things she needed from the store for the weekend. No. Hello. No. Love. No reference to the impending crisis. The coldness was absolute. She was waiting for me to break, waiting for my fear to win out. I realized that apologizing would not fix the underlying issue. It would just teach Chloe that whenever her family causes trouble, I will take the blame and I will shut up. It would reset the dynamic to exactly where it was 2 months ago, except with a freshly opened septic wound in my self-esteem. By the evening of the 6th day, the night before the deadline, I made my decision. I would not apologize. I would take the risk. I would confront the possibility of divorce, not by begging or yielding, but by finally telling her the truth about how I felt, the full truth that I had been too passive to express previously. I had to stop sacrificing my inner peace just to maintain outer calm. If the marriage could not survive a simple conversation about boundaries and respect, then perhaps it was already over. Merely waiting for the final, honest word. I needed to break the silence, not with capitulation, but with conversation. My passivity had led to the eruption. Now, Only active vulnerability could save us, if we were to be saved at all. I mentally prepared for the next day, bracing myself for the fight that would either end my marriage or, finally, genuinely, save it. I understood that this final confrontation would determine not just my marital status, but the trajectory of my emotional life. If I retreated now, I would retreat forever. I had to face her. I had to face myself. The week of silence ended on Thursday evening. I had spent the day at work feeling physically ill, dreading the conversation, yet determined to have it. I knew I had to tell my truth, or the marriage would die slowly, even if the divorce papers were never filed. I waited for Chloe to come home. When she walked in, she went straight to the guest room. The air was charged with hostile anticipation. I took a deep breath, walked to the guest room door, and knocked. "Chloe," I said, my voice steady, "we need to talk. Now." She opened the door, her expression tight and guarded. "I told you what I need, Alan. If you are not here to apologize, I do not have anything to say to you." "I am not apologizing," I stated, keeping my tone level, non-aggressive. "But I am here to explain 2 months of living hell. Because you never listened when I tried to tell you before." I stepped into the room and gently closed the door. This was it. The confrontation I had avoided for 3 years, 10 years, maybe my whole life. I had to embrace vulnerability. I started calmly, recounting the feelings that had accumulated from the moment. I found her family in our living room. "I know you think I was cruel, but I want you to understand that my outburst was not the start of the problem. It was the result of 2 months of being ignored and suffocated in my own home. I was trying to tell you I could not live that way, but you kept shutting me down." I explained the pressure of the first night, when she cornered me into saying yes in front of Harry, transforming me from her husband into a pawn. "You knew I am non-confrontational, Chloe. You used that weakness against me. You made it impossible for me to say no, and I felt utterly betrayed. That felt manipulative. And it started the resentment." I brought up the continuous mess and the financial strain, emphasizing the feeling of being disrespected not just by Harry, but by her lack of action. "I am not asking you to hate your family, but I was asking you to listen to me when I told you I was miserable. Every time I brought up the utilities, every time I mentioned the noise, you deflected. You told me you would talk to them, and nothing changed. It made me feel like my comfort was disposable, that my marriage was secondary to your duty, to your brother." The most difficult part was confessing my avoidance. "Do you know where I have been for the last 2 months? Chloe. I have been working every available overtime shift. Not because I needed the money, but because I dreaded coming home. I was physically and emotionally exhausted, but the office was quiet. It was cleaner. It felt like my home more than our house did. I was sacrificing my health just to avoid the chaos that you enabled." I told her that. The day of the milk spill, when I walked in, I was not greeted with a mess, but with proof that no one, not even my wife, cared about my home. "I begged you to talk about this multiple times. When you continually refused to listen to my feelings, all that pent-up frustration and pain had nowhere to go but out. I acted out in a way I should not have, Yes, but you cannot blame me when I had been trying to tell you I could not stay with them any longer. You ignored me, Chloe. You ignored my suffering. I finished by saying that, while I regretted the aggressive way I handled the end, I did not regret telling Harry to leave, and I would not apologize for protecting my mental health and our home. I spoke for nearly 10 minutes, pouring out 2 months of internalized distress. The intensity of it left me shaking again. But this time, the shaking was from vulnerability, not suppressed rage. I felt exposed, having finally broken my lifelong vow to avoid difficult truths. When I finished, the silence returned, heavier than before. Chloe had remained standing the entire time, her face a mask of complex, unreadable emotions. She did not interrupt, defend, or accuse. She simply listened, absorbing every word, every accusation of betrayal and manipulation. After what felt like an eternity, she slowly moved to sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the carpet. I watched her, my heart pounding, knowing this was the moment that would decide our future. I had done my part. The outcome was now entirely up to her. I watched Chloe sitting on the bed, her shoulders slumped. The silence after my confession was heavy, but different. It was not the hostile silence of the last week. It felt like a pause, a moment of deep, painful internal reflection. Finally, she looked up, her eyes watery but focused. "I have been doing a lot of thinking this week, Alan," she said, her voice surprisingly soft. "I was so angry when Harry texted me. So humiliated that you would scream at them. But after a few days, when I was alone in the guest room, I started to realize you were right." My breath hitched. I had braced myself for an argument, not an admission. "You were absolutely right," she repeated. "It was my fault. All of it." She stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the dark street. "I know I was manipulative that day in the living room. I insisted they stay, and then I put you on the spot because I was scared. I was scared to tell them no, and I was even more scared of what my parents would say if I let them leave." She turned back to me, the protective shield finally lowered. "You do not know this, Alan, but my parents and Harry are going through a really tough financial patch. Harry's entire livelihood depends on Dad's business, and the business is failing. They are hemorrhaging money. When the initial plumbing issue came up, my parents called me first. They essentially guilt-tripped me, saying if I did not take Harry, they would have to, and they could not handle the stress. They made it sound like a daughterly duty." Chloe's voice cracked. "They emotionally manipulated me into taking them in. And when the structural damage was found, I could not let them go because I knew Harry could not afford a hotel for 2 or 3 months. And I did not want to fail them. I wanted to be the good sister, the good daughter, even if it was at the expense of my own marriage." Her confession was a massive wave of information that washed away months of my misdirected anger. I had always assumed her loyalty to her family was absolute, a rejection of me, but in reality, she was trapped in a guilt-ridden pressure cooker. "I was so angry at you for the outburst," she continued, tears finally tracking down her cheeks. "But I was also relieved. Honestly, Alan, I was relieved. Because I did not have the courage to ask them to leave myself. They were making me miserable. 2. She revealed that she had been fighting with her brother and Sarah behind my back. I tried to talk to them about cleaning up. Over and over. I asked Sarah to please pick up the toys. I asked Harry to at least cover the extra utilities. But they just kept shrugging me off, saying they would think about it when they were less stressed. When I pushed, Harry accused me of being heartless and uncaring. Just like Dad used to when I stood up for myself as a kid. She had been trying to protect her family's image by hiding the truth from me. I never told you any of this because I did not want you to think badly of them. But you are right. They were inconsiderate slobs. They were too caught up in their own needs to care about anyone else in this house. Chloe walked across the room and took my hands. Her touch firm. Alan, I am so sorry. For the manipulation, for ignoring your feelings, and especially for the divorce threat. That was an extreme overreaction born from panic and guilt. Harry's text was a masterpiece of guilt, tripping, and I was desperate to fix it before my parents got involved. I did not mean it. Not really. I was desperate to force you to apologize so I could look good to them. She looked deep into my eyes. You were not the problem, Alan. They were. I put my desire to be perceived as a good daughter and sister above the health of my marriage, and I realize now that was devastatingly wrong. You were being suffocated, and I was holding the pillow. Thank you for being the one strong enough to make them leave. You saved us both. The relief that flooded me was physical. The knot of resentment that had tightened around my chest for 2 months completely dissolved. The core betrayal was not betrayal at all. It was a symptom of her own internalized trauma and family pressure. We were not antagonists. We were a team battling a toxic, external force. I love you, she whispered. Please let us fix this. We will. I managed, squeezing her hands. We will fix this. But first, we need to completely de-stress. She offered a weak smile. I was hoping you would say that. I think we need a weekend getaway. Just us. We can talk, reconnect, and flush out all this tension. We embraced. And for the first time in 2 months, our house felt like home again. The argument had been devastating, but the honesty was completely cleansing. The emotional reconciliation with Chloe was the necessary first step, but the final, liberating step required confronting the family system that had nearly destroyed our marriage. We booked the weekend getaway immediately. A short drive to the coast, to a small resort right on the beach. We drove there in comfortable silence, the car no longer a mobile box of tension, but a cocoon of shared relief. Chloe had planned everything perfectly. We hiked, we ate great food, and we spent a lot of time just lying on the sand, watching the waves roll in. The trip was less about romance and more about processing 2 months of trauma and 1 terrifying week of crisis. Finally finding neutral ground where our wounds could breathe. Finally finding neutral ground where our wounds could breathe. Finally finding neutral ground where our wounds could breathe. On our last evening, sitting on the beach as the sun dipped below the horizon, Chloe finally shared the rest of the story. I have not told you everything about what happened after our big fight. she said softly, pulling her knees up to her chest. I was still furious with you, obviously, when Harry and Sarah left. But as the week went on, and I started thinking about what you would do, apologize or lose me, I also started thinking about what they did. She paused, taking a deep breath. A couple of days before we talked, before I realized my error, Harry called me again, demanding I intervene. And I just snapped back at him. I told him he had been completely intolerable, that he had no right to demand an apology, and that you were entirely justified in telling them to leave. I told him that if they were truly grateful for the help, they would not have trashed our house and ignored my pleas for them to contribute. I stared at her, stunned. She had stood up for me, for us, while we were still separated by the threat of divorce. Why didn't you tell me this before? I asked, my voice thick with emotion. Because we were still fighting, she admitted. And I knew once I told you, it would be real. They had cut me off immediately after that call. Harry stopped responding to my texts, and my parents called me the next day, lecturing me about my lack of familial loyalty and how I was siding with my husband over blood. They were devastated, or so they claimed, that I would not even force a fake apology. So, none of them were talking to me. A wave of protectiveness washed over me. Her family was choosing righteous anger over their daughter and sister, the one who had sacrificed her peace for them. It is their loss, Chloe. I insisted, moving closer to her. You are a wonderful human being, and you tried your level best to cover for them. If they cannot see that, they are foolish. You do not need them. That conversation healed the last remaining wound. We returned home renewed, ready to confront the future with a united front. The final confrontation with the toxic system came 2 weeks later. Just as Chloe had predicted, the family did not apologize, but they did reach out, not out of love, but out of guilt-ridden necessity. It was her father who called first. Harry's house is finished, Chloe, he said, his tone heavy with manufactured disappointment. He had to spend thousands of dollars on a hotel for the last few weeks for absolutely no reason. The least you can do now is apologize to your brother for your husband's behavior. The brazen entitlement was astounding. They framed Harry's financial choice to stay in a hotel over a cheaper rental as my fault. Chloe, sitting beside me, took a deep breath. She was no longer the girl afraid of confrontation. She was a woman who knew her worth. No, Dad, she said, her voice clear and strong. I am not apologizing. If anything, Harry and Sarah should be apologizing to Alan for being such horrible house guests. They were inconsiderate, messy, and financially selfish. If you cannot understand that, I do not want to talk to you. The fight was immediate and vicious. Her father started shouting, accusing her of turning her back on her family. Chloe held firm. She hung up and blocked his number. Then her mother called, repeating the same manipulative lines. Blocked. Harry predictably was next. He texted first, then called, leaving an angry voicemail demanding she watch her attitude toward her parents. Chloe did not even listen to the message. She simply blocked him too. The act was brutal, final, and necessary. She spent a couple of hours emotionally depleted, crying in my arms. grieving the family connection she desperately wanted, but which did not actually exist. But by the end of the evening, she felt the relief I had felt when I finally stood up for myself. "The weight is gone," she whispered, resting her head on my shoulder. "I am done being their doormat." We both knew that we would be the villains in their story forever. The ungrateful couple who abandoned family in their time of need. But standing up for ourselves, together, was worth every bit of familial censure. Our marriage had not just survived the explosion, it had been forged anew in the heat of that shared crisis. We had established a crucial boundary, and it felt like true, lasting peace. It has been a year since our last major update. A year since Chloe blocked her family. A year since the suffocating silence of that ultimatum week. That distance has been the greatest gift to our marriage. We successfully talked everything out, establishing new, clear rules for communication and conflict resolution. We promised each other that we would never let resentment fester again. I am better at articulating my needs before I reach a breaking point. And Chloe is fiercely protective of our boundaries, a role she has embraced with a passion I deeply admire. We finally moved past that fight. It has become nothing more than a painful but crucial turning point. We were able to salvage 6 years of history, not by ignoring the problem, but by facing the problem and the trauma that fueled it head on. The loss of her family was tough for Chloe initially. Grief is complicated, even when it is for toxic people. But she found incredible support in my own parents, who stepped up instantly. They were appalled by the stories of entitlement and have been wonderful, consistent, and respectful sources of familial love for her. The house feels like ours again. It is quiet. It is clean. When things get a little messy, we clean them together without resentment. The 2 months Harry and his family spent here are now just a bizarre, crowded memory, an artifact of a marriage that almost failed. I am posting this final update now, because we have news. We are not just going strong, we are about to expand our family. Chloe is in her 2nd trimester of pregnancy. She made the announcement on social media a couple of weeks ago. She posted a picture of us, smiling, holding a tiny pair of shoes. It was a beautiful, public proclamation of our happiness and our new beginning. I knew she was doing it not just to share the news with our friends, but to offer an olive branch to her family. A pregnancy. A grandchild. Surely, this would be the event big enough to finally shatter their ego and prompt an apology. Or at least a congratulatory text. She was very disappointed, and if I am being honest, so was I. No one reached out. Not her mother. Not her father, not Harry. Silence. They chose to maintain their narrative of being the wronged parties, prioritizing their indignation over their daughter's happiness and the arrival of a new family member. Chloe was upset for a few days, understandably grieving the family she wishes she had, but she quickly rallied. My parents, on the other hand, have been ecstatic, doting on her and helping us prepare. Their love, my love, and the excitement of the baby are more than enough. I realize that their absence is a quiet victory. They are not here to complicate the pregnancy. They will not be here to judge our parenting choices, and they certainly will not be here to fill our home with chaos. Their loss is our peace. They never get to, with a 50, they will never get to meet this child because they could not humble themselves enough to apologize for being bad house guests. That is a harsh lesson, but a necessary one. I do not regret the decision we made. We chose our marriage, our peace, and our future family over a toxic obligation. This baby is arriving into a quiet, secure, and loving home. One that we fought hard to protect. Our experience, terrible as it was, taught me the importance of speaking my truth. And it taught Chloe the importance of choosing her marriage. We came through the fire stronger, armed with the resolve to protect the peace we fought for. I could not be happier with the life we have built together. This chapter is closed, and our new life is just beginning.